Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's disability information video where we will be talking about cerebral palsy. So cerebral palsy is a group of neurological disorders that appear in early childhood or infancy and remain into adulthood that affect an individual's body movements or motor control. So to kind of remember at what cerebral palsy means, basically cerebral means brain and palsy means loss of impairment or motor function. So when you think of cerebral palsy, think of a brain disorder that affects an individual's ability to move or causes motor impairment. So motor just means, it's your ability to move. So when you have a motor impairment, you have a loss in your ability to control movements. So cerebral palsy is caused by damage to the cerebral motor cortex, which is a part of the brain that controls muscle movement. Because this area of the brain is damaged, the individual's brain is unable to properly direct or control their own body movements. So basically, for a neurotypical person whose motor cortex is functioning properly, they can come up with what they want their body to do, and then send that neural impulse gets sent through their spinal cord, and then their body is able to just do it. So right now I can just control my movements pretty easily, but for someone with cerebral palsy, this part of their brain is damaged, which means that the neural impulses are unable to properly transmit from their brain to their body. So this affects their ability to control their body. So the damage to this part of the brain can be from a number of causes, including this part of the brain not developing properly during pregnancy, or from injury to this part of the brain before, during, or after childbirth. So this can be caused by something like oxygen deprivation, for example, or just general brain damage. So regardless of the cause, the damage is irreparable for those with cerebral palsy, meaning that the impairment is permanent. So cerebral palsy is a lifelong disorder. So it's not someone with cerebral palsy is basically born with it or develops it during the first couple years of their life, and they just live with it. So it's often the case, it is the case that someone with cerebral palsy, that's sort of all they know. It's not like the halfway through their life they received this damage to their motor cortex and then lost the ability to move. This inability to control body movements has been with them since the beginning. So now I'll go through some of the symptoms of cerebral palsy. And what I want to acknowledge before discussing these symptoms is that cerebral palsy can actually affect everyone differently. So everyone will have different symptoms depending on exactly which parts of the brain are damaged. But fundamentally, all of the symptoms are related in some form to body movements and the brain's ability to control body movements. So I'll list out the symptoms right now. So the first symptoms that's fairly common is ataxia, which is a lack of muscle coordination when performing voluntary movements. So it's basically an inability to coordinate your muscles to perform movements that a neurotypical person might be able to perform easily. So for me, I can move my arm, but someone with cerebral palsy might not be able to do that as easily. Another symptom is spasticity, which means stiff or tight muscles and exaggerated reflexes. And some final symptoms would also be difficulty with precise movements and also variations in muscle tone. So muscles can end up being too stiff or too floppy. That's the word my source used when describing it. So those are sort of the various ways that your body movements can be affected by damage to your cerebral motor cortex. But what I want to bring up before wrapping up this portion of the video is that it's really important to recognize that In cerebral palsy, symptoms vary greatly among individuals depending on which parts of the brain have been injured. So, all people with cerebral palsy have some problems with movements and posture, and also some also have other impairments related to other areas of their brain being damaged, including things like intellectual disabilities, seizures, abnormal physical sensations or perceptions, and they can also have other medical disorders. For example, people with cerebral palsy may have impairments involving vision, hearing, or problems with language and speech. So what I really want to emphasize is that cerebral palsy affects everyone diagnosed differently. As I mentioned right at the beginning, cerebral palsy is a group of disorders. It's not itself a disorder, it's a group of disorders that's referring specifically to damage to the motor cortex. But this damage affects everyone in different ways. So that's sort of what I wanted to convey as a central takeaway for this video. So now that we've kind of covered what cerebral palsy is and what it means, we can now move on into the next portion of our video, which will be an interview with someone with lived experience. I'll see you in a couple moments. Hello everyone, and welcome to the second portion of this week's disability information video. Joining me for this interview portion of our video is Luis, who is our SIL coordinator at RCD, which means the Support for Independent Living. So basically, Luis just helps people find employment or volunteer opportunities related to their interests. So thank you for joining me this week.
And thank
Luis.
you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, what are two aspects of your life that cerebral palsy affects that other people might not know or think about?
Okay, and if you don't mind, I'll just give you a brief blurb on what cerebral palsy is in case someone is watching and is not familiar.
Okay.
So cerebral palsy is an injury to the central nervous system of the brain that can occur anywhere from in the womb to up to 3 years of age. If you sustain some type of injury to the brain after 3 years of age, they don't call it CP anymore.
It's just a brain injury.
Interesting that they chose that. So in my case, I was a premature baby and I didn't breathe properly when I was born, and it resulted in restrictions in my mobility. And so
Gotcha.
now you were asking about two aspects that people may not realize.
Yes.
Well, one thing, because it's a random injury, it was once said to me that although there are classifications of cerebral palsy in terms of, for example, my cerebral palsy is called spastic cerebral palsy. Some people have hemiplegia, some people have ataxic CP. There are larger classifications like that. The truth is there are as many different types of CP as there are people who have it, because everybody's individual injury is unique to them.
Absolutely.
So oftentimes people will only think of CP as people who have more severe mobility restrictions, perhaps an inability to speak, or needing supports on their wheelchair in order to be able to sit up. I've actually experienced people arguing with me that I don't have CP.
Wow.
Because they've met people who have CP and I'm far too mobile.
Everyone's an expert.
I don't actually have CP, which really blows my mind that somebody would think they would know better than I do. But anyways, it happens. Yeah. So just be aware that we are a very diverse group of people. You can have someone who has very mild CP that you might not even realize they do. And the other thing that people should be aware of is that although many, many people have secondary disabilities, because they have a brain injury, such as hearing impairment, visual impairment, learning challenge, the CP itself actually is referring to the mobility part, but people may have any other number of other challenges as well.
Yeah, I think those are two great points of clarification for
Yeah.
what it means to have CP, because as you mentioned, it can affect everyone in a different way who has CP. It's very much related to how your brain is specifically injured and what parts are kind of affected.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's important for people to recognize that CP is not just one sort of, it doesn't just look one way. It can express itself in many different ways depending on the person. So,
exactly.
yeah, I think that's a great thing to bring up. So I appreciate that you've shared that insight. So now, moving on to our next question, the thing I wanted to ask you is, what have been two of the most important things for you in managing cerebral palsy?
Thank you. And actually, when I first read your question, I was like, well, good grief, managing, you just do, because it always has been, right?
It's just your life.
And you solve your problem as you come along. But when I stop and think about it, the reality is, it's the inside of my home, for example. If my bed were just a fraction of an inch higher than it is, that's the difference between my being able to get in and out of it independently. My grab bars have to be just so, or they're no use to me. So accessibility is huge, unique to you. And that's, of course, true both in your home environment as well as, the many accessibility features that we enjoy in the community overall. If we didn't have accessible wider doorways and automatic doors, which, by the way, there are never enough of out in the public, then we'd be stuck at home. And and being able to use public transit or handy dart, those things make a huge difference.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a really, really important point to touch on, because for people who don't have cerebral palsy and don't have mobility issues in general, it's not really, you don't really consider, going to a store and opening the door. It's just natural and it's very intuitive because it's been set up for you in mind. But when you're someone with a mobility issue or cerebral palsy, the specific way it's set up can really affect whether you can use it or not. Moving on into kind of the second phase of our interview, we're hoping to sort of spread a bit of positivity through this YouTube series. So what I wanted to ask you was, what sort of things really make your day?
I think obviously when I can get to and from where I want to go and do the things, that's nice. But when I do run into a challenge, I really appreciate people's patience and understanding.
Being aware of the other situations people might find themselves in, and trying to be empathetic and understanding when dealing with these people, because it's not, everyone comes from a different background and is going to have different challenges. So it's important to recognize that and still try to move forward and work with each other despite that. So thank you for sharing that insight. And the last question I wanted to ask you today is, what words of empowerment or encouragement would you give to people with cerebral palsy?
And I think I was thinking about this, and I would have to say that my encouragement would be, to all of you, but particularly those of you who are like myself and are in our middle age, and we are noticing changes in our mobility as we get older. When you think about that actually happens to everyone, regardless of whether you have a disability or not. So I would just encourage you to embrace the changes, because they can actually be a hidden blessing you didn't know you were going to have. For example, about 3 years ago now, home support came into my life. Well, actually, I never really appreciated how much energy I put in to doing everything myself. And it's been really nice to have that extra hand. So I tell the ladies that they are a gift to me all the time. Similarly, I also made the decision to start using HandyDart, where I was using the public system, and I'm not saying don't. If you can do it and it works for you, take any resource you can and use it to your fullest. But don't be afraid to use something else. You might find that it opens up a new chapter of freedom that you didn't know you were missing.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think as you mentioned, you know, people with cerebral palsy are going to go through life changes like everyone else. They're just sort of on a different track with different experience. So I think that's a really important point to kind of recognize when we're bringing these people to mind. So yeah, I think, thank you for sharing your insights with us today and giving the perspective of lived experience, which I think has shed some really valuable knowledge on the topic we're covering today. So thank you to our audience for joining us this week. And I hope to see you all next week in our next video for the Disability Information Series. All the best, and bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.